Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, model railway enthusiast, and I wanted to pick up on the series that I've been doing about developing an N-scale, all-Japanese model railway. And I'm at the structural landscaping stage. I talked about building the board, I've talked about laying out my basic track loops and the way that they connect and some sidings. I've talked about installing turnouts and wiring them so that they can be controlled remotely. And now, having got a sense of roughly where I want stuff, I'm going to start the basic landscaping and developing one particular area of the layout. This is quite an extensive project, so I'm breaking this video into two sections. The first one will be the structural stuff. The second will be the decorative stuff. Now, as I said before, I have one area which is my main station with a sort of urban development. I have a river area. I have an area where I'm intending to put a Japanese castle. And then on the other side, on the right, upper right quadrant, as I face it from the controls, I wanted to build a kind of mountain village complex. Specifically an onsen village. Now, in order to do this, I have to create raised layers of landscape, and I'm running track through two sets of tunnels. So what I'm going to be focusing on here first is the structural integrity of the raised area with the tunnels, and then I'll move into talking about the landscaping and how I'm trying to get something which is distinctly or specifically Japanese, so that the feel of the thing and the look of the thing doesn't simply feel like any other model railway. So when I was first thinking about this, I was just going to have my inner loop go through the raised area, through the hills and mountains, and I was going to have the outer loop go around the back of it. But when I started looking at it, I didn't think I had the room. I didn't want the mountain to look like just a big hump in the middle with the track going around the outside. And you sometimes see this on model railways where there's a tunnel, and it's clear that we're building a tunnel because we want to have a tunnel. But the thing that it's tunneling through looks too small to actually need a tunnel. So in the end, I decided to have a larger tunnel for the inner loop to go in one, curve around and come out the other side, and a smaller tunnel for the outer loop where it can go inside. And then because that track is coming up to go over the river, it'll be a shorter tunnel. That means I have tracks at two separate levels that are both going to need to be going through the mountain, and the mountain needs to be high enough to seem to justify those tunnels. I'm doing this, largely for visual interest and because it's fun and it creates a greater sense of variety to the layout. But first and foremost, of course, these tunnels have to work as tunnels. I've had problems in the past with some tunnels. So the first thing that I'm doing is making sure that my clearance is absolutely right. So take my measure and I'm going around and I'm looking at exactly how high my trains are in order to get an appropriate height for my tunnel mouths, so I can make sure that we have at least that much clearance all the way around the tunnel area. And in the case of these N-scale trains, even with the raised rail bed, which adds something like a quarter of an inch or so to the bottom, I should be okay with a 2-inch clearance. 2-inch clearance should get even my trains that have little upper electric pylons on them, should give them plenty of room. So I need to cut wood that will provide supports all the way around my tunnels, because what I'm going to do is lay stuff on top of them. Now, it doesn't matter, of course, if I go a lot higher than that, because the only part where you're going to notice that height is where the track actually enters the tunnel. And I can always create an artificial tunnel mouth, a front, that will lower it, that will make it look a little bit more realistic. What I want is to make sure there's plenty of room above the track all the way around. The other thing, of course, is that I'm going to need to have a lot of supports under here. And because this track turns, you're always going to get points on the track where especially with a multi-bogie train, where it's going to swing a little as it goes around. So I want to give myself plenty of room between the track and the verticals. My track is not fastened down at this point because I'm deliberately sort of creating a little wiggle room. I want to make sure that I have space to adjust. So I'm going to give myself a lot of space inside the tunnels where the track goes around so that there's no chance of my train actually hitting the supports. Once I have my vertical supports in place, I can start overlaying the longer panels that are going to support the upper part of the hill. And of course, always check to make sure that I still have plenty of clearance. There's not going to be a lot of pressure or torque on these joints, so I don't need nails or screws or anything. A spot of Gorilla Wood glue is more than enough to secure them. A little weight and they'll be solid enough to work with within an hour or so. With the front tunnel pieces in place, I can now add the supports for the shorter tunnel at the back. Because of the elevation leading to the bridge, these need to be set a little taller than the inner loop tunnel. One more test run to make sure that I have both the height and width that I need for both tracks inside the tunnels. So as you can see, I'm creating those level areas, building in structures. Again, partly this is to make sure that there's plenty of clearance above the railway lines themselves so that nothing hits anything. But it's also to provide a sort of structural basis for all the landscaping that I'm going to do on the top. These things don't need to be load bearing per se. They're not going to have to carry a lot of weight, but they do need to be structurally solid enough for me to build on them. So I'm using mostly offcuts of bits of wood, some plywood sheeting. These are all just things that I had lying around. Some strips here and there. And then in other places I'm using cardboard or expanded polystyrene or styrofoam and other things that I can do. And part of the fun of this is the randomness of it, just creating contours. I know roughly where my buildings are going to go, so I want those level surfaces. And I know where my road needs to go. So I want to build the core support for that. And again, that's just going to be either wood or cardboard strip, which I can paint and deal with later on. The other thing, if you have seen any of my HO scale videos, you'll know that I recently had trouble with a derailment inside a tunnel, which caused all kinds of problems and which required me to eventually rip out most of the landscaping, which was a massive pain. So in order to avoid that problem this time, I'm building in a removable panel from the back side of the mountains so that I can lift it out and get access to the track. If I have any derailments or problems, I should be able to clear up that way. This is just two panels of wood fastened together at a right angle that will sit on the corner, cut to the right size. And then I've added a couple of little blocks glued in place that will sit by the track so that they hold the panels in place so they can't move. Lastly, I've glued on a couple of little handles to make the removable panel easier to lift out. As I said, I want to make this a Japanese layout. And sometimes you see Japanese layouts that look Japanese because the rolling stock is Japanese and there's kanji signs on the buildings and things like that. I want to go a little bit further than that in that I want the landscape itself to feel Japanese. And if you spend any time in Japan, there are certain features that you're going to see which are different from in other countries. Japan is, of course, a collection of islands. which means that you're never that far from water. It's also very mountainous, so you're also never far from streams and rivers that come down from those higher elevations. And Japanese agriculture makes use of these features, both the mountainous quality and the abundant water supply. So I'm going to try to incorporate some of that into what I'm building. Now, as I said, this is not just going to be a village, it's going to be an onsen village. And onsen is a traditional Japanese hot springs, right? There's a lot of volcanic activity in Japan, and there's a lot of natural mineral springs that come up out of the ground hot. And an entire culture and industry has developed around the onsen as a place for people to relax and soak. If you saw my recent review of the Hotspot TV show, you'll know that that was based in an onsen hotel at the foot of Mount Fuji. And that when I lived in Yamanashi, and going to the onsen was a fairly frequent thing. In a lot of more lavish onsen resorts, the hot springs will collect in pools and such outside, so you can go out and sit in nature in the water. And I'm sure you've seen images of the monkeys in the pools. So you don't want to do that because it's not hygienic. Anyway, so I had a series of buildings, these inns and onsen facilities, which are the little Tomitech kits. And I had a number of those that I wanted to make central to this development. So what I'm building is a kind of elevated, hilly, rocky area with places for these buildings to sit. I'm going to need road access. Part of the road I'm going to cut out of chipboard since it's rigid and give me a basis. So it double duty as both the road surface and the actual structural incline that I need. And then in other parts where I don't need it to be quite so strong, I can just use a piece of cardboard cut to shape. Again, none of these joints need to be especially strong, and they don't need to be neat and tidy. None of this is going to be visible. It's all going to be substructural. There's going to be a top surface over everything. You won't see any of this. Because the buildings are going to sit there, I'm going to need horizontal platforms that are built into the mountainside. I'll disguise them, I'll create contours around them, but I'm going to want flat surfaces that I can sit these buildings on. So that needs to be built into the structure from the outset. And I'm going to want water channels and little pools here and there, which I can use to suggest the presence of places where people will go and soak. I'm also going to add a couple of features that to me feel very Japanese. On the one hand, as I said, the Japanese landscape is very mountainous. And so people have got very good at using areas of land that in most countries would be considered unworkable because they're too steep. So one of the things that you see, and you see this all over Asia, is a terracing, right? Where the slope of the ground is leveled off in different strata and then used for planting. So you've got very small, narrow areas. This is particularly used in things like tea planting, for example. So I'm doing that here. Draw out the dimensions of the area on the layout board that I'm going to be filling, and then use that as a stencil to create my the lowest level of the terrace, and then add more. I'm using a 1/4-inch MDF just because it's easy to cut and it retains a certain strength and slickness. It's easy to precisely build on top of each other. It doesn't have the irregularities that you get in regular wood, and it's cheap. And I'm creating here a little terrace that I can put tea plants on, or something that looks like little tea bushes. And part of the fun of it is creating a little irregularity the idea is that you're working within what are the natural contours of the ground. Of course, you're creating the natural contours of the ground, but you're doing it to make them look a little bit irregular, as if this is the way that this has been developed. Once all those pieces are cut, they can be very simply glued on top of each other up to the level of the highest point, in this case the road and one of my onsen buildings. The idea is that the onsen village is getting income from tourists, but it's also getting income from the other little bits of agriculture that people do. This is very common in Japan, where you'll have very, very small farms and people making money off various different things. So in this case, I'm having my little onsen hotel connected to a tea plantation. Once I have my structures in place, I'm going to use a combination of plaster cloth and paper mache. The plaster cloth is a really simple, easy, quick way to create contours over existing structure. This is a really simple product. It comes in rolls, it's cheap, it's easy to buy. It's cloth which is impregnated with plaster. You cut it to length, you soak it briefly in water, and you drape it over your supports. And within a day or so, it goes hard. It's not incredibly strong, it won't bear a lot of weight, but it supplies a workable surface and gives you enough hardness that you can add to it, build on it. Where the plaster cloth is going to get covered with vegetation of some sort, I don't need to do much to it. I might add a base color of paint just to sort of give it an overall look, but then I'm going to add turf, bushes, trees to cover it over. In areas where I want it to look like stone, I will probably then add just a very, very thin layer of paper mache. And when I say that, I mean strips of newspaper soaked briefly in a mix of white glue and water, about half and half. It doesn't really matter. And that will give it enough strength when it dries to create a flat, slick, paintable surface, so you don't have that sort of fabric look from the plaster cloth. And this will allow me to sort of give it a slightly rockier kind of appearance. You'll notice that in some places where I thought it was a little too smooth, I've added pieces of styrofoam that have been positioned with a little wood glue, and I'm putting the paper mache over the top to smooth out the contours. You can see also how this is starting to develop a little ravine down the center of the hill. This will be the basis for my main stream, which will feed the onsen pools. In addition to that paper mache rock face, I also want to get the look of a craggier, more rugged kind of rock to suggest where it's been exposed and has fallen away or has been cut by people. And to do this, I'm using plaster molds of rock face. Now you can buy these things, and they're good. You just pour the plaster in and then turn them out of the rubberized molds. It might be useful to add a tiny bit of dish detergent or something like that, diluted inside the mold so that it releases easily. Of course, if you do a lot of that, you start to see repeating patterns. But, you know, if you turn them upside down or move them around a little bit or break them and separate them, you usually get away with it. In this case, because I was also looking to just create a sort of thin veneer of rock face, I'm doing an even simpler and cheaper method, which is to use a piece of aluminum foil or tin foil, crinkled up and shaped into given sides so that the plaster won't run out when you tip it in. And then you pour it in. When the plaster has dried, I would give it usually a couple of days. Make sure it's thick enough to be structurally sound. Give it, you know, at least maybe half to 3/4 of an inch, or maybe even more. Give it a couple of days to dry, and then peel it out of the foil. As you can see, this comes out fairly easily. If it breaks, it's not really a big deal. Again, it's not structural. I'm just going to glue these pieces in place and then add color and shrubbery and so on to cover any gaps. And of course, the gaps themselves can look perfectly normal and interesting, like little caves and fissures in the rock. Once everything has had a chance to dry, I apply a coat of primer, standard household base paint with a stain blocker in it that will cover up all that newsprint and give me a good solid base color on which I can then apply paint. You'll notice also that I've incorporated a piece of rock that I found in the garden because I liked it, and I've built that straight into the layout over one of the tunnel mouths. So that's where we are at this point. All the structures are in place. It's now ready for paint treatment, for buildings, for trees and vegetation, and all this stuff that will make it look special. That's coming up in the next video. Keep your eyes open. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe, check out my books. Check out my Patreon page, and as ever, of course, thank you to all my patrons who make this otherwise unmonetized channel possible. Check out my little Dashery store for shirts and mugs and things like that, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye.